Good afternoon, Baiba and Tracey.
Good morning,
Good
Christopher.
morning. Good morning, both.
So, Tracey Follows is a leading futurist and CEO of FutureMade, known for her work on emerging technologies, identity, and the evolving systems shaping society. Ranked among the world's top futurists, she advised global organizations, including Google, the United Nations, and the US State Department, on how megatrends and intelligent technologies are reshaping markets, governance, and human agency. She also has a long career as a strategist between 2007 and 2014 and was head of a chair at APG from 2014 till 2015. She is also an author of the book called The Future of You and a creator exploring the balance between human and machine capabilities in an increasingly automated world. Today, she joins us to discuss the future of identity, power, and what it means to remain human in machine-shaped systems.
This is something we've been wanting to do since before we even conceived of the pod. So it's really quite special. So get to ask the first big question that we ask guests that we are so curious to see where it goes from here. And this is something that we talk about a lot, and we always want to put honesty at the center of our conversations in our podcast. We believe every practitioner like yourself, they learned something early in their career, and maybe they were trained a certain way, or they had certain practices or different belief systems or points of view. But then they start to actually do the work, and then their work changes and the work changes them. And they might have, like you have had, different versions of you over that period of time. And at some point, you have to start to unlearn things because you understand that things work a bit differently. And so this question is to you. What are the things that you've had to unlearn throughout your career?
Oh my goodness. Because I'm so old, there's loads of them. I was trying to think, because I knew you would ask me this question, obviously. I was trying to think what is the biggest one, maybe not the first one, but what is the biggest one, or what has been the recurring theme? And I guess the one that's really I'm thinking about a lot at the moment is that when I first came into advertising, which was, well, 1993, because I was an account man from 1993 till 2000. Then I went client side in 2000, then back agency side in 2007. Then I left agencies and corporations really doing advertising in, what was it, 2014. When I came in, I was a part of the reason I wanted to do it is because I thought it was all about originality. I think I have learned that I'm a creator, I'm an originator. I'm an originator of whatever it is I do. But it's about reaching for those ideas and thoughts and concepts that haven't been articulated, or perhaps haven't been discovered and articulated in a certain way before, and we can get onto that later. But one thing I know I'm not over all of this time is a completer finisher. And anybody who knows me will be nodding along right now. I get very bored very quickly because I love to originate ideas, and I always have lots of ideas. And I thought when I went into advertising that it was all about originality. It was about newness. And I guess that sort of comes across in lots of agencies' creds and lots of things you read about advertising or marketing. And yes, it's very creative. There's a sense of creativity. But I think over the time, Christopher, I learned it's not about originality, it's actually about familiarity. And that was really starting to hit home sort of 2010, 2011. And the reason I mention that is because I think it's why I felt so much of a misfit for such a long time not all the time, but as I got more and more senior through advertising and marketing, I felt like it was very hard to get original ideas through. It's very hard to make people understand or encourage people to understand what's coming next, for example, which has obviously been my job for the last, 15 years or whatever, and probably always was something I was always trying to do, because people just aren't ready to go there. But it's more than that. Substantially, the whole sector, the category is about familiarity, and I kind of have come to terms with that a lot more now. And I kind of understand it, that of course you're trying to get people to engage in products and services, and in order to do that, they need to They need to feel there's some familiarity, so it's not threatening, or it's easy to buy, or they know how it fits in their repertoire. So one can understand how familiarity is so important, but I think it's something I underestimated, didn't really realize. I thought it's all about originality, so it's all about the new stuff, it's all about the creative stuff, it's all about bringing those novel ideas. But I learned, I think, over time that either people aren't ready for them, they can't absorb them, they don't know what to do with them, and it's just not really about that. And I think part of what I also learnt was that partly because of this, the whole market or the industry or the sector, whatever you want to call it, is really consensus driven. So much of it is about consensus driven. And I don't say this in a pejorative way. I mean, I'm just stating it as a thing I've learned, I think, and people will have other perspectives, I'm sure. But I really do think it's so consensus driven. And once a group of people have shut down their thinking to an idea that's been reperceived in a fresh way or is completely new, it's very hard to get it back on the table. It's hard to get people to align to it. They can't really deal with it. And so much of what I do now and have done for as I've been doing featuring is about reperceiving. It's about reperceiving the world around you, reperceiving your reality, seeing it in an original way, ways that you've never seen it before. I mean, I do so much work around perception, but I think for a long, long time, I struggled in the industry because I thought it was all about originality, and I was just on the wrong track. It's not. It's about familiarity. I actually, just before I hear what you have to say about that, is that I think it really came home to a lot of people during COVID that there was just so much groupthink around a lot of narratives, a lot of messaging, not just about COVID, just because people were socially atomized, and actually belonging to some kind of community became very important. So people were put into their little, categories and groups online to think this, and another group was to think that. And I think it became blatantly obvious, just how important consensus was amongst groups of people during that time. And I think the ad industry or marketing or whatever is absolutely no different. I've got a favourite saying with Dr. Johnson's, which is actually talking about authors. He's talking about the most compelling or engaging trait or skill of an author is to make familiar things feel new and new things feel familiar. And, that's what we're all doing all the time, arguably. But I think I just got the balance right. And so I had to unlearn that advertising was about originality and come to terms with the fact it's actually about familiarity, and realize that's not really what I want to do.
But you achieved so much, I would say, in your career, especially in advertising industry, and you were also visually a different person, and then you changed. Can you elaborate a little bit on that kind of transition? How did you took this new path? How did you transform yourself? Because I believe that it's the most interesting part in your whole career, this transition into becoming a futurist.
But I think it's always easier looking back, isn't it? So we've got insight, hindsight, and foresight. And we're always trying to balance those three. Looking back, it became more obvious. I was already doing futures of, and I was always doing trends reports and already being asked in some quarters at some board meetings to do the future of snacking or the future of VoIP. Let's take you back, future of VoIP. And I loved doing that. It was like a thrill for me to do all that sort of stuff. And I loved presenting, but researching it and presenting it to people. And then that sparking a real conversation around, a what if kind of conversation where people, whether it's the CEO or the CFO or the account directors or whatever, they don't normally have that time in the day to sit down and think, what if? Because everybody's so keyed into and focused on, producing and manufacturing some creative artifact of some description, understandably. So I really loved that. And actually, I think I'm very grateful to JWT. When I was CSO at JWT, they sent me on a course which I couldn't have ever imagined going on. It was an amazing course. It was called the X Factor, and they took a female leader from each of the businesses. And we were taught by or coached by Charlotte Beers, who was I think the first female leader or chair of Ogilvy, as it was many, many years ago. And we went to a place in the Hamptons for a week, and then we went to her place elsewhere in the States. And it was a real unpacking. You talk about unlearning. The first week was unlearning everything you taught yourself about your limitations, what your gripes were, any victimhood mentality, all this sort of thing, and really cleared out a lot of that. And then the second week, many weeks later, was about rebuilding a new role for yourself. And to cut a long story short, she said to me at the end of this, "You're a very innovative person and you're in a 150-year-old agency. You might want to have a think about that." And I went to lunch with the global CEO and we talked about what could I do, which was a bit more sympathetic to my innovation skills and futures and what I wanted to do. And we discussed it and debated it, but we didn't really align on the right role in the right place. Because at the time I would have had to go to New York. And I didn't really want to do that at the time. And so I left and I thought, you know what? I'm going to just do this thing I want to do, which is featuring. And at the time, there wasn't really a futures community in marketing. I mean, it was there in sporadic sort of little hubs and whatever, but it was quite hard to find the community. I ended up going to the University of Houston and studying the certificate course there and getting to know a lot of the futurists, both the lecturers and other delegates there, and started to build up my community, and then just started like that. And lucky for me, I'd had some clients in the past like Google, Telefonica, Virgin, who actually said, "Oh, come and do a project here," or "We come and speak on this panel here." Debbie at Sky gave me an amazing project on the future of media to celebrate 30 years of Sky. What was the next 30 years going to be? So actually, my contacts and people I'd worked with in advertising and marketing were very good to me. Steve Renakis was at Google. He gave me loads of work at Google. We did stuff with Google Creative Labs. And so I actually was able to start a company of some description with some projects. And then I just got into it. And if I look back now, I don't think there was anybody, there might have been two or three. There's Faith Popcorn in the States, who I talked to actually. She's amazing, still going now. And she was a famous futurist for sort of brands and in this sort of area. Sorry if I've forgotten someone obvious, but now look at it. Every corporation, every brand is doing strategic foresight. They're building up their capabilities. I remember talking at Unilever. Keith Weed had me over at Unilever. It must have been about, I don't know, 2016, 17. And he was saying to me then they were just creating some opportunities to have, foresight practitioners, not just insight people. At JWT, I had renamed, I'm remembering now, I had renamed the market research insight department to planning foresight. And I changed their job roles. I changed what they're doing and make it much more pointed towards the future. Because Nestle in particular had said to me, "Oh, we really want this," And I would go and I would talk about the new reality. Everything was happening at the time in about sort of 2013, 2014 to their salespeople at a conference or an event. And they really loved that. I think the problem for agencies at the time was, how do you monetize that? How do you charge for it? Which is really a issue they've got for any strategic thinking right now. The most valuable part, they can't work out how to charge for it, which has been a perennial problem. But it's very worrying that it's never really been solved to such a degree. And now you've got AI coming in and that's disrupted it that issue yet again. When you've got big companies like Nestle, I thought, well, actually, I can create planning foresight. And I knew already that AI or data or some kind of intelligence was coming down the line. So in 2013, I redid the positioning for JWT and the proposition, and it was about ideas with intelligence. So how could you create these amazing big conceptual ideas, but underpin them with robust intelligence that came from data or in time AI? At the time, Google Glasses was coming out. So we were understanding already that the physical world was going to have a digital overlay all over it. And so potentially consumers or users were going to have their own personalized versions of the world, of reality. So that was an idea. And I was pushing that forward. But in companies that big, it doesn't matter whether it's agency side or brand side, you've got to enroll people in those ideas. And if you can't, you just can't get any traction. And I didn't feel that I could get the traction. So so I left and started up my own thing. And as I say, I was lucky enough to get some projects to start with, went to University of Houston to retrain, and then really dug in on the history of futures, what was future studies, who were the main architects of it, who were the practitioners, what are the different theories of it. Joined the Association of Professional Futurists, which people can still do today if they're interested and they're operating in this area. And then over the last 15 years, it's massively mushroomed. So I take that as a bit of foresight, actually.
Yeah, foresight on foresight.
I saw it as a trend to be a bit like meta about it.
One of the things that you've always been so good at is how you play with language and how you use terms, often very simply, to conceive of something that might just be slightly off of what someone thinks it is, you know? And then one of the terms I had in my notes that I wanted to speak to, actually already used, which was the concept of reperceiving.
Mm.
And we love to talk about language and terminology and shared language and how language can act like these words act like little machines that create little assumptions among how people work. And that concept of reperceiving is something we'd love to hear how you practice around reperceiving, or what is the process behind that?
It's interesting you pick up on that because I was just doing a course at London Business School. So I was delivering a session, an afternoon session. And that was one of the things we're talking about. And the way I approach reperceiving is to encourage people to challenge their assumptions, because so much of Future's work is really about the biases or assumptions that you have underlying your usually unarticulated version of the future. Everybody's got a version of the future in their head, but not that often do they get asked to sit down and discuss it with somebody else, particularly in the workplace. But it's driving everything they do, everything they believe in, the decisions they're going to make in the short term, the midterm, the way they think they're going to end up living. We can come on to that. There's a very important concept around self-continuity, which I think is going to grow in importance. But reperceiving is really like there's a very simple tool that you can use. There's a great quote by Pierre Wack, which is all about it's about reperceiving the reality around you. And once you can reperceive your reality, you change what's possible in the future. And I would say in the same way, once you change your vision of the future, you can change the way you perceive and therefore reperceive the reality around you, because you start to make different choices and act on different information because it comes into your view. So there's a very simple tool, which is you write down what you think the underlying assumption is to something, an idea, a concept, an action, a decision, an agreement, whatever, and then you just flip it. Just flip the assumption that lies underneath and then see what the outcome of that is. And it was fascinating as it takes you into place that you probably had a blind spot about just because you were a little bit stuck and didn't realize that everything you were talking about or envisaging or imagining but actually relied on an underlying assumption. And until you get to those, you start messing about with them, challenging them, turning them upside down and inside out, your blind spots continue. I think this is a very good example of one of the ways you can use AI really productively and creatively, which is to challenge it. Where are my blind spots? If I was to reverse this assumption, I mean, it's better to do it in your head because you're training that muscle to attack your own thinking, if you like. But you can use it with AI, and if you haven't got much time and you're on a project or something like that, I'm always asking it, what are my blind spots? What have I missed here? But if I was somebody else in the market who thought exactly the opposite, where would that net out? Because this is great. This is all the mind mapping you can do and starting to realize where your competitors would end up because they've got a different underlying assumption. All those sorts of things we're supposed to do as strategists, but sometimes forget to do because, you're on a project and there's a deadline. And this is what I mean about consensus. And the consensus is just driving you one way. And it's very good to stop and question pretty much everything. I interviewed Chase Hughes as part of one of my podcasts, and he is brilliant at sort of behavioral communications, propaganda, ex kind of Navy SEAL, all this sort of stuff. I mean, he's absolutely amazing. And he said to me when we were talking about online information, disinformation, all this sort of stuff, he said, I would ask everybody to just do one thing, which is when you come across a piece of information, doesn't matter whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, whatever, just stop and go, yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe, exactly. Because we're absorbing it all the time and then it becomes our reality and then we can't see beyond it, and our identities become very fixed as that information starts to become attached to our identity, and therefore to challenge the information, is to challenge our own self, our own sense of identity. This is what happens online. This is what has happened in social media, why people become so fixated with a point of view, and particularly a political one. And he's just saying, when you are confronted with a piece of information, whether it's through social media or mass media or the TV or print or whatever, you just stop and go, yeah, maybe. And I love that. It's just to take a time out, be agnostic about it, and then have a think about the evidence. And I think that's another way of thinking about how you might go about reperceiving the world.
I would love to go back a little bit because I love that some sort of like a thought about the transformation. That's also something that we have talked about in this podcast. That's also something that I would say we are also thinking a lot about. And even yesterday, we had a special guest in our community event where she was talking about the transformation in a context that you can't change the behavior. You need to provide some sort of like a value for those people whose behavior you want to change, and then you can find a way how to do the transformation. And you just said a couple minutes earlier that you also did did a huge transformation inside of the agency to transform the name of department, the roles and things that people should need to do. And you said at some point, I don't want to push this anymore. Maybe there is some
I failed to convince enough people. That's the truth of it. Yeah.
No, but I mean, like from today's perspective, maybe you have some sort of like a different, I don't know, view how to
Mm.
do transformation with all the reflection and, being just in a different place in your life.
Yeah, honestly, I think I didn't appreciate the work you have to do, the groundwork to allow people to get to that place where they're open to that kind of transformation. When people are so incentivized, when everything depends upon not following this new line, and when it feels so novel and different, and to my first point, unfamiliar, they can't grasp it. They don't want to grasp it. And guess what? They're not incentivized to grasp it. So it makes it impossible to get any change. I mean, one of the interesting things about futures, of course, is that element of change. And especially now, when organizations are, I think, increasingly sort of decentralized, you've got 5 generations in the workforce, you've got people working from home, there's a lack of sort of social capital or glue, as John Doerr would call it, keeping everyone together. It's really hard because everybody's sitting there, to one of my earlier points, with their own version of the future, their transformed world or untransformed world in their heads. And it's really, really hard. And so all you can really do is work quite hard to unpick, or in your language, get people to unlearn some of the things that they think are fixed and will never change. And I honestly just think that's very, very different for every single, how you go about that has got to be different for every single organization, because so much of it is embedded into whatever the culture of that individual organization is. So I don't really know the answer to it, other than saying I think it's really, actually really, really specific. Don't know, what are your thoughts on it at the minute, transformation?
I think that we are on the ongoing process to explore. And that's why we're having these multiple conversations with different experts coming from change management, coming from marketing, coming from, as you are, from being previously in advertising, now being more into the topics about the future. So I do believe we are trying to put some sort of like answer together from different angles. I'm not sure, Christopher. What is your take?
Heidi Hackemer and Philip Horvath both spoke to. Philip speaks to one of the hardest parts of transformation, as he refers to it, because it's a kind of death. There's an older version of you that is no longer present, and the separation anxiety of someone having to say, you know what, that person is not here anymore. I can remember them, but because of neuroplasticity and a growth mindset, you've grown, you've changed. And for some people, that's uncomfortable. Heidi Hackemer referred to it as an ego funeral. We all need to throw an ego funeral. We need to celebrate it. We need to be open to us growing and transforming ourselves. And I think for some people, it is that, perhaps that separation anxiety that makes it difficult, because there is a sense of who am I now and what am I giving up?
Yeah, and that speaks to like I suppose my new thing that I'm embarking on, which is not just futurology and futures, but identity. But I think, just add to that point you're making, and to give you a model that I think is quite interesting, it's the futures triangle, because when you work with groups of people and you're looking at a futures triangle, I mean, I take the point about the death of an old identity and the birthing of a new one. I do agree with that, although it's quite a complicated matter, that is. With the futures triangle, you can try and look at insight, hindsight, and foresight. You can try and look at all of those. So in each corner of the triangle, you've got like the push of the present, the pull of the future, and the weight of the past. And I think it's really great if you can get groups of people to really work around that. You're trying to get them to understand that future is contested. We've all got different points of view, come together, but can you create or agree at least on a plausible possible future in the middle of that triangle? But what it does do is it acknowledges the importance of the past, the weight, but it calls it the weight of the past. This is Sir Hale's kind of model, and well, one of his amazing models for futures work. And the question is, how much of the past do you want to drag into the future? How much do you want to bring with you? You might want to bring something, but not all of it. Now, everything that got you to where you are today isn't going to serve you going forward. And of course, you've got to have a vision of the future. Otherwise, if you don't have a vision of the future, you've no idea where you're going. So you can't really make any decisions about anything. And then you've got the push of the present, which is like all the trends and the kind of stuff that's propelling you, nudging you in certain directions. I do think that is an interesting tool. Not just, I don't mean in a sort of, workshop environment. I just think as a mental model, that's a good tool for people to try and balance those three elements and then start to challenge themselves about, well, are we making some assumptions about how much we're going to take from the past to the future and, all this sort of stuff. And then the other model I think is really interesting is just think about zoom out, zoom in, which is a bit of a self-continuity thing, as I said to you before. I'm getting more and more interested in self-continuity, this idea that we have a version of our future self. And if we can depict it really visually and in detail, very richly, then we'll make better decisions about what we do today. And there's quite a lot of academic research that shows that that is the case. You'll make better health decisions, better financial decisions if you're thinking about your 60-year-old self, not your 25-year-old self if you're 24. And it's not to say you always do that all the time. But one of the interesting things that came out after I'd written the Future Review about the future of identity and technology, MIT created their Future You chatbot, and I interviewed them again, Patty May, who's amazing, who has always been like in the fluid interfaces team at MIT. She and some of her researchers there created Future You, an interactive chatbot, and you can put in a photo of yourself. It depicts you as a 60-year-old. You answer some survey questions. Then you have a conversation with your future self. And I think this is, at the minute, it's kind of quite a naive, simplistic example, but you can imagine in 10 years' time, it will be much more sophisticated. And I think these are the sorts of things that AI, again, is going to allow us to do. Self-continuity, you have to work quite hard to remind yourself to do this. But actually, we might have tools at our fingertips that are doing this almost automatically or autonomously for us and depicting our past selves, our future self, and many other possible selves in the present. And actually, that's going to help us rethink change. Changes should really then feel a little bit more fluid and less risky and threatening. And actually, you should be able to reperceive things all the time.
Leads me to think sometimes too that this transformation piece is these people are already in you. It's just almost like a mixology. You're dialing them up or dialing them down like a graphic equalizer.
It's interesting you say that because I wrote a paper and did a little video, and I gave this paper at a couple of events. The point of it was there's a model in it which takes you from the design self to the database self. So away from old thinking of the self as one, I mean, you're integrated, but one whole thing that is taken as a unit, which can never change because it has to be consistent over time. And just lots of evidence around how that might have been useful in the past. That's debatable. But actually going forward, it's a more complex self. To your point, there's many different sorts of selves. Some are operating, some are used selves, some are lots of different kinds of selves in the complex self. And actually that makes the self much more fluid, more programmable and plural, if you like. And actually that takes you away from a prison of identity towards a prism of identity where you're refracting lots of different versions of yourself for different contexts. And that's a really important and much more sort of Eastern philosophy way of thinking about the self, that the self is much more relational. Lots to do with identity in the self is to do with the context and the relation relationship between you and whoever you're in the room with or speaking to or whatever. It's not just me as an individual, I'm fixed, I don't change, and you'll just have to meet me where I am, which is quite an arrogant way of thinking about the self if you look at it like that. And so this is very true. And I think as we go into a world of automation and AI, where we do end up living much more distributed lives with distributed selves, for example, this is much more modern and a better way to think about it. So I think about it as a database self, not a design self. And funnily enough, we're just about to put out a piece of work on applying this to brands. Because actually, if you're thinking about yourself as an identity, you can say the same thing for brands, that brands need to think of themselves as a database brand. It's really not the individual attributes. I mean, they're important, yes. It's certainly not the brand as a whole, because that needs to show up in different contexts in different ways. The attributes that make up a brand, in the same way as the attributes that make up a person, are very important, and they're sort of nodes in a network that makes up the brand. But it's really the relationship between those different attributes and the people who recognize those attributes, or the other brands you partner with, or the context you're in. And actually, once you can plot that database of relationships between all those different attributes, then you can basically make your brand machine readable, because the machines can understand that as structured data. What they don't really understand is individual stuff, because they're trying to interpret the world, and they can only really do that through the structural data and the relationships between all this data, or between these attributes. So if you can sort of help them interpret that a bit, then you're really creating a database with all the coordinates, if you like, of how to put these attributes together to mix, remix, arrange, rearrange the brand in the ways that it needs to appear or turn up in certain contexts. And so I think really one of the things that I've been doing on the self and identity, actually, like 5 years later now, you apply it to brands, is a much more modern way, and I would argue a relevant way of rethinking what a brand is, not just how a brand can be discovered now in a machine world, but actually what a brand is in a machine world, in a world of AI. Because I think most people haven't understood that what a brand is has now changed fundamentally. It's not just applying it to a new context. AI has altered the entire world that we're going to be in. The environment is completely different. And so a brand, what a brand is also changed. I think if you want to make for humans, for brands to be understood by humans, fine, we can rediscover a lot of the fundamentals, which I think don't get picked over enough and do get ignored. But actually, if you want your brand also to be discovered and interpreted by machines, then you have to make a database brand as well.
I think it's a very interesting point of view, and I really love to hear all of those shifts that you are mentioning. And something that sticks with me from our conversation last summer is a shift that you mentioned was IQ, EQ, like emotional intelligence, and then there's intellectual intelligence, but the shift is towards the adaptability, or AQ. And that kind of stick with me because it felt like that is the big shift. And that is something that is like, what we are all observing, that we all need to become more and more open, how to adapt to, I don't know, potential next moment. And we don't know what will happen.
That's very true. I think adaptability is like an insurance policy against the future, because it doesn't really matter what the future brings. If you believe the future is something to be arrived at, it doesn't really matter, because whatever the future brings, or whatever you co-create the future to be, you're okay because you can adapt to it. It's interesting you pick up on that, because I do a lot of work on adaptability. I've got a whole course on adaptability, anticipation, and authorship, which is how to help companies, but particularly companies in sort of more creative industries, but not just that, actually succeed in those three elements. And adaptability, I work with a company that basically tests and helps train people on their adaptability. In fact, I did that assessment and it really helped me. I was like, it's funny. The first night, she was like, I mean, I could say you'll talk about unlearning. Unlearning is one of the first bits they talk about. There's 15, I don't know what they call them, vectors, traits, whatever they are. What do they call them now? Let's just say there's 15 ways in, or dimensions on this adaptability assessment. And the first one is about unlearning. And I'm like literally off the scale for unlearning. I'm like, And I remember saying when I did the assessment, yeah, I know why, because I'm not a completer finisher. I'm very happy to unlearn and get on to the next thing. I mean, I like to think I do retain some knowledge about something I've done in the past, but it's very important, adaptability. And one of the great things about it is something that you can train yourself on. You can be better, both in terms of your own character, but also creating the environment that speaks to adaptability. It makes it more possible for other people. And you can do it for yourself and you can do it for teams. And so, yeah, AQ, or the adaptability quotient, I think is very important. In fact, even in the last week, I've seen 2 companies talking about adaptability and training their people on adaptability. And when I've spoken to A- AQ .ai, they train huge amounts of people on this. And I think it really makes a massive difference, particularly for creative industries who are so used to talking about curiosity and creativity. That's great. But actually, that's great for noticing. "Oh, I noticed something really interesting." But how do you apply it? How do you respond to the thing you've noticed? That's through adaptability. And I've always thought that it was incredibly important. But I think now it's sort of hit the mainstream. But I, like you, would just say to people, go and find out more about it. Go read the academic papers on it. There's a Harvard Business Review essay on it from, I don't know, way back from about like 2011, 2010, something like that. I think it's finally found its place, adaptability.
I mean, this going back to that summertime conversation, there's a piece of this, the 2 echoes is I've referred to you as sort of like a punk planner, like punk planning has been your thing in a way because you so well understand the fundamentals over time that when you're reconceiving or transforming, it's like Lego blocks that you continue to shift and move, almost like a collage artist pulling things together. And it's one thing to just come in out of the blue and say, oh, I've got a naive new idea and I don't understand anything about the past. It's a whole nother thing to like know the fundamentals and the history and the academics piece of it so well, but be inspired by it and drive new thinking and then create something seemingly new, but based on a lot of familiarity. It's the 10th anniversary of 98% Pure Potato, which, still on many of our bookshelves is this wonderful record of the fundamentals of the past, of the origins of the strategy industry. And there's echoes of all those things you documented and learned that are still very much in you that you're building today.
I've always just thought of it, oh, I'm just an outsider. I just don't really see it like other people do, to go back to the consensus thing. I don't mind being an outsider, but I think I'm actually an in-betweener. I think that's really what I am. I'm an in-betweener. I've decided I'm an in-betweener, partly because the in-betweener was always like my favorite, I don't know, superhero character type thing. But also, I come from the Midlands, so it's not north and it's not south. So I think I actually grew up being an in-betweener and appreciating that it's not that it's neither one thing or another. It's just that there's a place that you can occupy, which is in between, which is very interesting, which again will give you one perspective and then another perspective. So again, to go back to our reperceiving, I'm used to that. I mean, there's a golden rule, of course, in futuring that if you want to go, you want to look 10 years, 20 years, you have to go twice as far back as you go into the future. I remember Paul Sappho saying that, and I thought, oh, yes, that's very true. And obviously, you want to go as far back as you can. I always used to go into brand archaeology when we had a pitch on in advertising. It'd be the first thing I did. Why was this brand invented? What happened? And what did they say the need for it was at the time? And inevitably, I'd find out that actually that still applies. It's just that it needs to be showcased and represented in a completely new and modernized way with a bit of a twist. And I think when you talk about the book, I'm looking up there because it's on my bookshelf. I think that's what it was. We were like, hang on, we're in between worlds now. We really are. All these people are in their like 70s and 80s. They invented planning. They went to the States and transported arguably one of Britain's greatest exports, took this strategic thinking over there, reinvented advertising. They're not going to last forever. We need to capture their stories. And that was an in-between world of like brand planning to John and I. It was John Griffiths' idea. He originated the idea. And as I was moving from VCSP to JWT, it was like, oh, that's perfect, because obviously we're going to go and interview everyone from BMP and JWT. And we talked to about 20 of the original first and second, maybe, generation planners. Yeah, you mentioned it's the 10th year anniversary. I should go back and reread it. John and I were talking about it the other day. But there's this new world emerging, and everyone was talking about Solo Mo and the new, Mo, you remember that? And South by Southwest was such a big thing then. Everybody's like, oh, digital, and it's all about, location won't matter anymore. Arguably, like, location's more important now than it was, ever. And all these sorts of interesting things. And we knew that planning was completely changing and that people were starting social media departments, if you like, and going, what's your Facebook strategy? And so we were in between these worlds again. And I do find that fascinating. Same as futures. I guess that's what futures is. You're in between worlds, in between these temporal, these horizons, these time horizons. And I think it just the in between places are the most interesting places to be. Yeah. You'll never pin me down.
We want to be respectful towards your time, and maybe we should need to wrap up this conversation. And as we got to this point to talk a little bit about the past, maybe we can also talk a little bit, and just very briefly, because this is a big topic, and maybe there's just like, I don't know, one simple thought. How do you see the future of strategy and advertising?
Oh my goodness me.
$1 billion question.
Yes.
This is a very typical question that normally young talent is asking to us.
So I think strategy is obviously going to go back into the brands and the companies. And in a funny sort of way, strategy is like going to be massively democratized through AI. I know lots of people think it's going to ruin and displace strategy. I don't think that's the case. I think in order to use AI properly, you've got to be more strategic. You've got to know what you're asking, why you're asking it. You got to know what information you're feeding it, blah, blah, blah. So I just think strategy, I don't think it'll be called strategy. And I think it will go back into the beast, if you like. So we had these sort of what you might call agencies, but I did a big project for an agency about 6 years ago where I said agencies won't exist because agency is going back into the corporation, into the organization, because agency is kind of infrastructural now. It belongs, okay, alongside humans, but AI as well. It's embedded in the corporation. So I don't think there will be agencies doing strategy. I think strategy becomes embedded into the infrastructure of corporations and the organizations. But then, of course, the question is, how does a human being work alongside those non-biological intelligences or whatever you want to call them? And that's really where the work on machine comes from, which is, what are the human traits and characteristics that we need to rediscover and enable to flourish again, alongside all the increasingly machinic stuff that'll happen. So strategy is going to sit across both of those sorts of things. But we won't call it strategy. It's just going to be stuff we do.
Are there new things that you've got coming out that we can address our listeners and watchers too, since you're always thinking about the future? I mean, we can talk about machines, but I have to think that's an episodic project. You release it in seasons, and oftentimes these things build into things on top of a book, into things. I know there's opportunity to future cast your own activities here.
Yeah, well, Machine is there's going to be a big piece of research on Machine, which is around what are the six unmachinables? What are the unmachinables that individuals need to, as I just said, like rediscover, maintain, encourage in themselves? So, without giving away what all those are, I'm going to research them, but there'll be things like intuition, imagination. What are those things? And obviously, I've got a hypothesis on those, but I want to research them. But that's a longer term thing, and that will become a big kind of research lab, hopefully, for that. But there's another piece which is going to be out quite soon, which is called the System and Self, and one of the first iterations of it is a card deck. So I'm very conscious again of agency. I think agency will reside in people. It does reside in people. At the moment, it's being trained out of us. So we don't realize we have personal agency. The system, as it becomes more infrastructural and AI becomes embedded, guides you to behaviors and kind of circumvents your choice. You don't even realize you have a choice on something because you're so in the system then, just like a cog in this big machine. And so there's an academic paper on this. It's a preprint, it's just been peer reviewed right now, but the card deck is the first interpretation or iteration of it. And the card deck it's a bit like a tarot pack, and it's got lots of system cards and lots of self cards, and you draw one system and one self card, and you basically challenge yourself to reflect on, actually, do I have more personal agency in this situation than I thought I did? Or how should I interpret reinterpret or reperceive the situation where I can do something about this. I'm happy to send it to you because I've tested it with a few people, so I should send it to both of you and see what you think. But that's going to go out as a novel futures tool for this moment in time, this moment where people are feeling that I've looked at a lot of longitudinal studies on this. Even people at work feel like they have less discretion, less agency over what they do and how they spend their time. And I think it's not true. I think it's just I think it's a psychological reaction to a technocracy, which is now in place. Which is asymmetric, of course. The technocracy, the system feels like it's got much more power over you as an individual, and you're just a small individual, and you can't have any power over this. But actually, you can. But again, it's about reperceiving your situation that you're in. So that's going to go out. And then what else? Yeah, the podcast, the Machine Dialogues, is a series on the future view. I'll still keep going with the future view because that's about identity and technology, and the Machine is very much about AI and how do we get to a place where, as Mark Benioff said, we need to realize that we are a generation of CEOs who are the last CEOs who will be managing only humans in the workforce. Like, once people understand that, then I'm afraid you really are going to have to reperceive what you're doing and how you're doing it and how you think about the future. Yeah, I've got quite a few projects and little tools and things I'm working on, which I hope, happy to send them to you if you want to test them out, trial them.
We will definitely encourage everyone to also follow Tracey on LinkedIn. And of course, look for her podcast on Spotify and I guess also on Apple listening platforms. It was a fantastic conversation as always. And see, sometimes we have conversations with someone and nothing resonates from those conversations. With us, there are still some thoughts that comes back from our previous conversation, I think last year in August. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It took some time to to finally find the moment, but I think it was worth to wait.
It's always great to speak to both of you. And I look forward to doing it again sometime soon. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you again.